Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this latest session on the second day of the 2021 ESPAS Annual Conference, which is a conversation on the geopolitics of the future, focusing on Europe, America, and the Indo-Pacific. Now, the concept of geopolitics had rather gone out of fashion until recently, associated more often with academics and practitioners from the 1970s, such as Henry Kissinger or Zbigniew Brzezinski, or with those who remade the world order in 1989 to 1992 with the collapse of communism and the end of the Cold War. But now, with the evident end of what we can perhaps call the post-Wall era, which characterized the last 30 years, geopolitics is back, based on the assertion of the nation-state on the international scene and the emergence of growing great power tension and competition, notably, but not only, between China and the United States. To discuss the changing world order of today and some of the implications and issues which this key development poses for Europe and the United States in the future, we are pleased to welcome, speaking live from California, where I think it's breakfast time, and thank you very much for making the effort to be with us so early in the day, General H.R. McMaster. General H.R. McMaster is a retired U.S. Army Lieutenant General, well known not only for his 14 months as National Security Advisor in the Trump White House, from which he resigned in 2018, but as a key thinker on strategy and geopolitics. Back in 1997, he published his first book, Dereliction of Duty, based on his doctorate on U.S. strategy and military leadership during the Vietnam War. And more recently, last year in fact, he brought out Battlegrounds, which is part treatise and part memoir on the emerging rivalry between great powers. He's also served as a professor of military history at West Point and as a researcher both at Stanford University and the International Institute for Strategic Studies, the IISS. And he's now back at Stanford as a senior fellow at the Hoover Institute, and he also teaches at Stanford Business School. And of course, General McMaster has also had a very distinguished military career, serving in the US Army in Germany, commanding troops during the Gulf War and subsequently in Iraq, working at US Central Command, and working closely with and advising General David Petraeus, including on and in Afghanistan. In 2014, General McMaster was nominated by Time magazine as one of the 100 most influential people in the world at that time. In his book Battlegrounds, General McMaster sets out a philosophy of how to promote better decision-making on foreign policy, writing about how important it is to think clearly about interests and objectives, and advising against, quote, making the mistake of confusing activity with progress, a stricture which of course applies more generally than just in the United States, I'm sure, and the importance of presenting options, as he puts it, differentiated by their level of risk, including the resources required and their prospect of progressing towards national security and foreign policy goals and objectives. He talks about the importance of presenting to decision makers multiple options as a means of providing best advice from across government. We would not and should not assume linear progress towards our objectives and instead acknowledge the degree of agency that others have over the future course of events. And it's in that perspective that General McMaster has very kindly agreed to talk geopolitics today with Klaus Welle, the Secretary General of the European Parliament. Klaus is very well known to us here in the EU institutions, and he has guided and modernized the European Parliament's administration for the last decade, having previously served as Chief of Staff to the President of the European Parliament, as Director General for EU Internal Policies in the Parliament's administration, and as Secretary General of both the EPP Transnational Party and the EPP political group here in the Parliament. At an earlier stage, he worked both as an economist and as head of European and foreign policy for the CDU party in Bonn, in the latter capacity advising the then German Chancellor Helmut Kohl. So before General McMaster shares his thinking on global challenges, I'd like to pass over to Klaus Welle to set the scene and say a few words by way of introduction. Klaus.
Thank you very much, Anthony, for this introduction. In fact, I'm very honored to share today the stage with General McMaster, who is not only a renowned military strategist, author, but who is also in a very illustrious line of national security advisors to presidents of the United States. I've been glad to have met still Zbigniew Brzezinski in his office in Washington, the author of The Great Chessboard. I've also been very honored to have had the possibility to meet with Henry Kissinger and discuss with him. And I think both of them, as the General as well, have inspired reflection on security well beyond their time in office. Henry Kissinger had to deal with the Soviet Union. He's managed to separate China from the Soviet Union at the time, and at the same time open the door for China on the global stage and for cooperation. In that sense, he's been one of the fathers of Chinese success. China now, under Xi Jinping, has become one of the main challengers, if not the main challenger of the West. And with Belt and Road politics, they are reaching all across Eurasia and beyond. So it is obvious that the unilateral moment, which was there after 1989 to 1991, is ended. We have entered into a conflict for number one, and I believe that that conflict will structure politics for the next generation. This is a conflict for power, but it's also a struggle for values. It will also decide in what kind of society will we live in the future, in democratic societies or not. And we already see that alliances are changing and shifting. We've seen AUKUS to come about. We see a different relationship and much more intense with India and Japan, and also strategic debate starting in NATO on its future duties. We see that much more analysis is going into production chains, and in fact they are reviewed. Discussions about sensitive technology, not only Huawei, also semiconductors. What does it mean that more than 90% of the latest generation of semiconductors are produced in Taiwan? So if we should put it into a nutshell, I would say that we are seeing a paradigm shift. For the last generation, after 1990, price and economy was crucial and the guiding principle. I believe that we are now shifting, and in the next generation, security will become dominant. At the same time, we have to acknowledge that also our societies are threatened from within. We've seen the march on the Capitol and scenes of violence and the attempt to hinder the completion of the democratic transition to a new president of the United States. And inside the European Union, we had our difficulties as well, and last not least, we've lost the UK in Brexit. But at the same time, we use our legislative and regulatory powers, for example, these days with the Digital Markets Act, to design new rules that could put limits to lies and hatred over social media that had such a detrimental effect. When I was growing up, the debate was very much about the Fulda Gap. I have the impression that for the future, we will be focused much more on the Taiwan Straits At the same time, we are seeing Russia amassing more than 100,000 troops to the north, to the east, and to the south of Ukraine. So as Anthony has been saying, geopolitics is truly back. So we are very interested to hear your views, especially also your views on China. General McMaster.
Thank you, Secretary General Klaus Welle and Director General Tesdell. Hey, it's a great privilege to participate in this important conference and to be with all of you. Thank you for the privilege of being here. If I might be American, and get right to the point, I think Europe has a vital role in the Indo-Pacific for many reasons. The stakes are high in the Indo-Pacific and beyond as the Chinese Communist Party, or CCP, races to perfect its technologically enabled police state and export its authoritarian mercantilist model. The stakes are high because if the CCP succeeds, the world will be less free, less prosperous, and less safe. Europeans, Americans, and our like-minded partners across the free world should resolve to compete more effectively, stop underwriting our own demise, and strengthen the rule of law and democratic principles, institutions, and processes. I think it's obvious to all of us that the CCP became more aggressive during the pandemic. CCP leaders believe that they have a narrow window of opportunity to strengthen their rule, revise the international order in their favor before China's economy sours, before the population grows old, before too many others realize that the party is pursuing national rejuvenation at their expense, and before unanticipated events like the pandemic or the nascent real estate crisis expose the vulnerabilities that the party created in their rush to surpass the free world and realize the party's dream. The CCP is obsessed with control because it is afraid of losing its exclusive grip on power. Fear and ambition are inseparable. The manipulation of history during the recent Communist Party plenum and the overall narrative of regaining honor lost during after the century of humiliation as China takes center stage in the world is meant to mask the horrible loss and suffering the party inflicted on the Chinese people over the past century, and to portray the China model of one-party authoritarian rule as superior to our democracies. The CCP strategies for maintaining control and gaining economic and strategic advantage have names like military-civil fusion, Made in China 2025, and One Belt, One Road. The goals are to create exclusionary areas of primacy across the Indo-Pacific region, achieve preponderant advantage in the emerging data-driven global economy, dominate global logistics, critical supply chains, and communications infrastructure, and rewrite the rules of international trade and political discourse. Across those strategies, the CCP employs co-option, coercion, and concealment. China co-opts countries, international corporations, and elites through false promises of impending liberalization, insincere pledges to work on global issues, and especially the lure of short-term profits and access to the Chinese market, investments, and loans. Co-option includes debt traps set for corrupt or weak governments. Corruption makes countries and corporations, co-option makes countries and corporations dependent and vulnerable to coercion. The party coerces others to turn a blind eye to its human rights abuses and support its foreign policy. The party demands that countries, companies, and international organizations support its violent self-conception as a one-party nation with no room for plurality except on its own rigid terms. The party's success depends on concealment, as it portrays egregious actions as normal practice. That is why we should correct two misunderstandings that help it hide what is at stake in its campaign of co-option and coercion. Both derive from the conceit that the CCP responds to external actions rather than pursues its own ambitions. The first misunderstanding is that Chinese aggression is the result of US-China tensions. But consider a survey of CCP activity from military aggression along the Himalayan frontier with India to the South China Sea to the Taiwan Strait. How about cyber aggression in the form of massive industrial espionage, diplomatic aggression in the various forms of wolf warrior diplomacy, economic coercion toward Australia, Lithuania, and many other nations and companies, and political subversion of international organizations such as the World Health Organization and the Human Rights Council. It's obvious that the United States did not cause CCP aggression and that China's promotion of its model at the world's expense is the real threat to security and prosperity. The tendency to blame ourselves for the most egregious CCP acts derives from our self-referential tendency to attribute causality to us alone. That is why I think that the phrase now popular in European Union discussions, strategic autonomy, is counterproductive and mildly offensive. Strategic autonomy suggests a moral equivalency that helps China conceal its objectives. Some of America's closest friends in Europe and beyond proclaim that they do not want to choose between Washington and Beijing. But the record shows that the actual choice is not one between Washington and Beijing. It is a choice between sovereignty and servitude. The second misunderstanding is that competition with China is dangerous or even irresponsible because of a Thucydides trap, a term coined to express the likelihood of conflict between a rising power, China, and status quo power, the United States. CCP leaders use the Thucydides trap to escape responsibility and promote a false dilemma between passive accommodation and war. The party promotes the Thucydides trap to portray itself as a victim and accuse the United States, Europe, Japan, and others of trying to keep the rising power and its people down. We must correct these misunderstandings because they provide cover for the party, as well as those in our own countries who are eager to shrink from competition. Those who are shrinking from competition include investors who continue to pour money into Chinese stocks and bonds, undaunted by the CCP's increasing intervention in the private sector and the utter lack of transparency. One can imagine CCP leaders evoking the quotation erroneously attributed to Vladimir Lenin: "The capitalists will sell us the rope with which we will hang them." Except it is worse. We are financing the CCP's purchase of that rope. After we stop underwriting our own demise, we must strengthen democratic governance, rule of law, and freedom of expression at home and abroad. The party sees totalitarianism as strong relative to pluralistic democracy. Citizens' participation in the democratic process, however, has been effective in countering the CCP's predatory policies. Freedom of the press, freedom of the speech, and rule of law have allowed countries to expose the CCP's predatory practices and sanction those who enable it. Support for democratic institutions and processes is not just an exercise in altruism. It is a practical means of countering the CCP's campaign of co-option, coercion, and concealment. And finally, we should be confident. Democracy is resilient. Totalitarianism is brittle. Xi Jinping's speeches to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the founding of the CCP are compendia of admonishments, warnings, and threats. Chairman Xi is, of course, aware of another anniversary this year, the 30th anniversary of Mikhail Gorbachev's resignation and the end of the Soviet Union. So let us be confident, correct misunderstandings, compete more effectively, stop underwriting our own demise, and strengthen rule of law and democratic principles, institutions, and processes. Thank you. I very much look forward to the discussion with the esteemed Secretary General. Wonderful to be with you.
General, thanks a lot for this very inspiring talk. I think there are many elements which we can deepen. What I found also very refreshing is that you created this bond between geopolitical challenges, but also that the fight starts at home with our own democratic quality, with the freedom of press, with the quality of our democratic institutions and the freedom of expression, because that allows, in fact, every argument to be had. Could you deepen that a little bit?
Yes, thank you, Secretary General. There's so many examples internationally of how really democratic principles and institutions have prevailed against China's efforts to co-opt and coerce. I mean, in our own hemisphere over here, Ecuador is a great example of a corrupt government being voted out and the debt trap exposed that China had set for the Ecuadorians with this massive dam project that indebted future generations of Ecuadorians. There have been indictments and prosecutions, and other examples include Malaysia, of course, where the 1MDB role that China played was exposed. In terms of investigative reporting, I think John Garneau's work in Australia was particularly profound and inspired other investigative journalists to pull back the curtain on China's China's predatory loan practices, and as well as the malign influence campaigns that they conduct within countries. So I think these are just several of many examples, really, that cut across Europe and Africa and in the United States as well, where our strength has been our democratic principles and institutions. And Secretary General, if I might just mention, you mentioned the January 6th assault on the Capitol. Of course, that was heartrending for all of us who care about our democracies. But I also think this horrible assault on the Capitol, I think, inspired by a sitting president, also showed the strength of our democratic institutions. These false claims of corruption in the election were adjudicated in our courts. If you look at the actions of the Senate Majority Leader of the Republican Party that day on January 6th, he gave a very inspiring speech. The actions of the Vice President. And so I feel as if our democracies are much more resilient. And I'm reminded, and I'm sure you remember this as well, in the 1970s, there was a lack of confidence on our part, right? I mean, we saw the lost war in Vietnam, the resignation of an American president, stagflation, oil crises, the Iranian Revolution, and for America, a 444-day hostage crisis. And so there was also at the time the belief that the Soviet Union was strong, right, compared to our democracies. So I think that we shouldn't be complacent. Certainly, we do have to compete more effectively, but I would like to see a little bit stronger dose of confidence these days in our democracies.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's also true for the European Union. I mean, in which decade we haven't been in crisis? I mean, which courage did it take in the 1950s? For French people to open up and say we are doing something together with the Germans. And in the 1960s, then when we had the crisis about the empty chair from de Gaulle, and in the 1970s with, let's say, all the blockages in the Union, and the 80s, also the fight with the, let's say, with the East, and then the 90s to introduce a single currency. I mean, we needed courage all the way. So I think what you are telling us today is very important. I would also like to stress that this House, the European Parliament, is very much focused on human rights. This Parliament has established the Sakharov Prize, named after Andrei Sakharov, who fought for freedom in the Soviet Union. And this year's prize winner is Alexei Navalny. And in 2019, we had Ilham Tohti, who was fighting for the Uyghurs. And a whole number of our members are still under sanctions from Russia and from China for speaking out on human rights records. So that's something that's very close to the heart of this parliament. It's not always very much appreciated by executives who think, you know, we might be disturbing at a certain moment. But in the long and medium term, I think that's exactly the right approach to be taken.
Secretary General, I just applaud you for the strong stance that the European Union Parliament has taken, and now on Taiwan as well with the recent visit. I think that an ongoing visit. I think that the Parliament's been very, very strong, and I think contrast the strength of your convictions on human rights with the actions of, you mentioned, Russia and Vladimir Putin. There are more political prisoners now in Russia than there were during the Soviet Union. I think that's a sign of weakness. The weaponization of migrants on the Polish border in Belarus, I think, is a sign of weakness, as are these threats toward Ukraine. But we have to be aware of the danger from an insecure Vladimir Putin who remains determined to restore Russia to national greatness at our expense. Through this new form of warfare, this Russian new generation warfare. But I really think that the European Parliament has set a tremendous example in the area of human rights and advocacy for the freedoms that we know we can't take for granted.
I think you're absolutely right. And one maybe of the proudest moments, at least for me, was when during the struggle for democracy in Ukraine, on the Maidan Square, people had their barricades, and on top of the barricades, they put the European flag.
Yes.
They put our flag.
And that famous image of the EU hand shaking the Ukrainian hand as well. Absolutely. Right.
And many of our members were incredibly engaged, spent days and nights over there, because they wanted to say that democracy and human rights are not ending in the European Union, but they should be enlarged also to the East, and that this is, in fact, an entitlement. I mean, we know very well that we are allies, we are partners with the United States, and also we owe our freedom to the United States. I can say this as a German, in fact, twice, in the fight against Nazi Germany, which was won finally because of the American troops went in so decisively, but also against the Soviet Union. So that's why maybe sometimes we are a bit worried that that relationship could weaken, that the focus of the United States is going somewhere else. And we also have the clear impression that increasingly it's expected from Europe to deal with issues in its own region itself. And that's maybe contributing to this debate about our own, let's say, strategic capacities. Maybe the word strategic autonomy is not the right word, but I think that the European Union needs to have this dialogue about its own strategic capacity, think more mid and long term, start to reflect what we need to do in a burden sharing also with the United States and others. I think that in itself is rather a healthy development.
I agree. I think what we should be focusing on are complementary capabilities and capacity. And of course, there is frustration in the United States oftentimes about the failure to live up to the Wales commitment. And of course, during the Trump administration, Germany bore the brunt of that disappointment. But I do think that really Germany is essential in this area. And I know that we don't want to talk that much about specific countries, but I do think that when America was spending for the European Deterrence Initiative, that was just additional spending for the rotation of troops to Poland and to the Baltic states, spending about the equivalent of 1/3 of Germany's entire defense budget. This is where I think American taxpayers get frustrated about that. So I think burden sharing is, and as you mentioned, right, all of these tensions are not without precedent. You mentioned a lot of the the tensions and difficulties we had in the Cold War. This was of course an issue that goes back to the 1970s, right? So I think we will get through this time, and then also economically, I think it was a bit of bad timing, maybe to say the least, when the U.S. State Department announces that what's happening in Xinjiang is in fact a genocide, and I think that's undeniable. But that's the same moment when the European Union announced the draft comprehensive agreement on investment from China. Of course, it was full of the same false promises that China made on accession to the World Trade Organization, including improved labor standards at the very moment when we were learning about slave labor and forced labor in Xinjiang. So I think at times there are disappointments in our European friends. I think it goes both ways, certainly. And I would put Nord Stream 2 in that category as well. So, I think that, hey, in our free and open societies, we're going to have differences. And of course, we can overcome those differences because we are bound together, right, by a common commitment to principles that we all hold dear. And I think also just a practical recognition that we all need one another, right? And we know, I know we're talking about the Indo-Pacific more specifically, but I think we all recognize that if we don't stand together, our adversaries will try to divide us, right? We'll take a divide and conquer approach, and so this is why I think the Biden administration's emphasis, right, on a unified approach with Europe. I never did understand how steel and aluminum tariffs on our friends and allies helped us with China. I'm glad that those have been lifted. So I think that I think we should all not be emotional about this. We should recognize that the tensions we have in the relationship are not unprecedented, but our interests are aligned. But most importantly, our principles are aligned.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what surprised us here a lot was that the steel tariffs also were argued on the basis of national security concerns. That was difficult to imagine how this can be.
Yeah, how do you think the Canadians felt about that? Right. So it is. I think we're on the upswing here. But of course, better relations have to be more than better atmospheres at cocktail parties in Berlin and Paris, right? It has to be a better relationship for a purpose, and that's why I think the recent commission and the work that the EU is doing on the Indo-Pacific is so important in a way that the joint communication that came out recently, because I think we have to align our efforts in a practical sense, right, to help build a better future for generations of North Americans and Europeans to come.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I think sometimes also when our people are in Washington, of course, we are surely not a superpower in security and defense, but we are a regulatory superpower. We are very strong on economics. So it's very good to hear that, the European Union itself, and not just individual member states, can be a strategic partner of the United States in this. And the question will be with the pivot to Asia, which in fact has not started with the Trump administration. It started with the Obama administration, and it continues with the Biden administration, because simply economically so much more power is concentrated over there. So how do we work in that triangle between the United States, Europe, the European Union, and Asian countries, democratic Asian countries, but surely also China, because the biggest polluter now in CO2 is China. So we need to get a grip on that. So to a certain extent, of course, there needs to be pushback, but to a certain extent, there will also need to be cooperation to get control of some of the most pressing issues.
Well, I think that what's important to note is that that the calls for cooperation with China as an end in and of itself can be damaging, I think, to our efforts to compete effectively. And those who call for a return of cooperation and engagement with the Chinese Communist Party, I think, are just ignoring the fact that the party has a long history of making false promises to cooperate on international issues, fully intending never to meet those obligations. So I think what we can do first is align our efforts against various forms of Chinese Communist Party aggression and economic aggression in particular. I know you're aware of a broad range of legislation that is making its way through the U.S. Congress now to address some of the issues you mentioned in your introduction, supply constraints associated with microelectronics and semiconductors, for example, security of supply chains overall, which, as you mentioned, over the years became too biased in favor of efficiency rather than resilience. And then also protective measures, right? It's protective measures against industrial espionage and the need to work together cooperatively with like-minded partners, with the EU in particular, but with Japan also, on emerging technologies critical to remaining competitive in the emerging global economy, but to defense as well. Restrictions on investments in Chinese companies that are developing next generation weapons or are complicit in a genocidal campaign or are perfecting their technologically enabled Orwellian police state. I mean, all these are measures that I think we should all take together across the world's largest economies and include others as well that are vitally important, like India. And on the issue of climate change in particular, I think what we should do is view the interconnected problems of climate and CO2 emissions associated with that, and energy security, and food security and water security and health security together. Because when we don't consider these interconnected problems together, we suboptimize and we advance non-solutions. And I think a recent example is our efforts in Japan and Germany to make a leap immediately to renewables without a bridging strategy that includes, nuclear and next generation nuclear, modular nuclear power, and natural gas as a way to bridge away from coal in the near term. So I think this is what we can work together on, are real solutions. And I think what we ought to do is prioritize India as a place to help demonstrate that these solutions can work at scale in a developing economy. Because, hey, we all know that, right? The solutions we come up with that will only work in developed economies will not save the planet. It won't even delay our demise. Right? What we have to do is make it a false choice, a false dilemma between either energy security, or reduction in greenhouse emissions. I think we can do both, but I think what we see too often is the advancing of non-solutions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in this parliament, we started already 6-7 years ago a really large-scale exchange with India. On the administrative level, we've been receiving more or less every year before COVID 20-30 staffers from the Lok Sabha, from the lower house in India. And we could see that from the Indian perspective, the European Union is a perfect partner because we have very little baggage, very little historical baggage. And now that the United Kingdom has left, we even have less historical baggage. So I think that's a relationship which is very interesting for them, but also very interesting for us. But you're making
as a former colony ourselves here, we shouldn't have historical baggage either, right?
I see that you have a memory which is reaching very far backwards. Absolutely. So basically you're making the argument that democracy has to matter and that democracy has to be the decisive element that should bring people together in countries.
Absolutely. And I think this is the great promise is, right, that in democracy, people have a say in how they're governed. Wang An, who was a Chinese immigrant to the United States, he said of his adopted country, this is the founder of the very innovative Wang computers. Remember, back in I'm sure that was for many of older of us, our first computer. He said of his adopted country that, in democracies, we don't always live up to our ideals, but we have the ability to self-correct and improve short of revolution, right? Because we have a say in how we're governed. And Klaus, what bothers me a lot today about today's discourse is what we hear a lot of times is people who are giving up, right? And I think we've tended to put the words institutional and structural in front of every problem. And what I think that does is it robs people of agency and leaves us with a toxic combination of anger and resignation. So I think what we should recognize is, hey, we all have a say in how we're governed and in the policies that are important to building a better future. And let's exercise that agency and work together.
Yes, and what I like very much is that you're not looking here on the foreign policy perspective, but we are also looking on how we can improve, and that's one of the debates which is currently extremely lively within the European Union. Are we always living up to our standards when it comes to the rule of law, the freedom of the press, and in fact, balance of power systems inside our own countries? And that, of course, shouldn't concern just a very few countries. I think many of us still have space to improve.
Klaus, I agree, and I think that of course how the prevalence of and rightfully so of ESG issues and in boardrooms now across the world. This is environmental, social, and governance issues, and I think it's very important that for example, genocide should be an ESG issue, and I think that what we all might be able to do is figure out what is the government's role in helping businesses make decisions consistent with what I would say should be a Hippocratic oath taken associated with doing business in China or accepting Chinese investment or investing in Chinese companies. And that would be to do no hurt or harm in three ways. First of all, don't help the Chinese Communist Party gain an unfair differential advantage over us in the emerging data-driven global economy, or to gain an advantage over our militaries that could be mobilized against future generations. The second part of that Hippocratic oath would be don't help the party perfect its technologically enabled police state and commit genocide as part of that, and to repress the people of Hong Kong and across the whole country. And the third would be don't compromise the long-term viability of companies in exchange for short-term profits. We've seen so many companies go through this where to gain access to the lucrative Chinese market, they'll transfer intellectual property or technology to a Chinese company that has to, by law, act as an extension of the party. That company and other Chinese companies receive massive subsidies. And once they begin to produce your product, close you out of the Chinese market, and then dump goods on the international market and affect your global market share. So I think we ought to probably stop that. So I think that if there's legislation that could help companies make those decisions, I think that's wholly appropriate. And I think this is tied, of course, to the issue of supply chain resilience that you brought up at the outset.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think that's a very important point. I remember some years ago, the expression was coined about chimerica, or chimerica. So the very close linkage of China and the United States in economic terms, and that's surely also true for the European Union, very truly the case for Germany. We are very, very much intertwined in how we are producing, how we are trading around the world. So in that sense, this situation is not comparable to the situation before 1989. We are much more connected.
Yeah, I think companies have to ask the question, how do you insulate yourself and your employees from the coercive power of the Chinese Communist Party? And we've seen that coercive power used against many companies, right? Automobile manufacturers in Xinjiang who are saying, oh, what genocide? I don't see a genocide going on. Or apparel manufacturers who are, if they have the temerity to say, hey, we're against slave labor, get sanctioned. Or we saw with the National Basketball Association or the Marriott Hotel chain. I mean, the list goes on, right? And so I think that we have to ask this question. I mean, if we're going to invest in growth markets, maybe there's some other growth markets we could invest in, such that we don't have to compromise our principles to do business and to improve a company's bottom line.
General, great privilege to have had that conversation with you, and I'm sure that everybody on the screens has enjoyed it as much as I've done. And I would like to give the floor back to Anthony. Anthony.
Well, thank you very much indeed, General. Thank you very much, Klaus. Very stimulating conversation about some of the really big issues of the moment. And of course, touching, among other things, on this whole issue of strategic autonomy. And I'd just like to add, if I may, that I think there's a bit of a misunderstanding sometimes across the Atlantic on this, because it's not only to do, of course, with security and defense, it's also to do with our own economic position here in terms of self-reliance and dependency upon others, trying to make sure that in the area of investment, which you've mentioned, supply chains, rare earth materials, whatever it might be, that we're not in a position where we find that we lose our capacity to act. And so this whole debate about risks, opportunities, of course, as well, and resilience, comes together in a way to try and make sure that Europe, like the United States, is in a position where it can continue to be a key global actor. Thank you so much for sharing your views. I think that it's been an extremely stimulating discussion, and we really appreciate the fact that you've done this so early in the morning in California, and you've allowed us to really get an insight into your own thinking and thinking more widely in the United States. We really appreciate it.
The privilege is mine. I just want to tell you, I was serving the 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment in November 1989. When East Germany lifted travel restrictions to the West. So I believe in Europe. I believe in a strong Europe, and it's been a tremendous privilege to be with you. Thank you so much for the opportunity.